There's a grave in Russia, about 34,000 years old, and inside it is a man buried with roughly 3,000 ivory beads. 3,000. Now here's the thing that should stop you cold. Each of those beads takes something like an hour to make by hand. Do the math. That's thousands of hours of labor, months of a person's life, sewn onto the clothing of a single dead man, then dropped into the ground to be covered with dirt forever. Nobody wore those beads again. Nobody traded them. They were just gone, buried on purpose. And that tells us something astonishing. Long before banks, before coins, before cities, humans had wealth. Real, hoardable, show-off able wealth. And they made choices about what to do with it that were emotional, strategic, spiritual, and sometimes completely baffling. We assume rich people are a modern problem. They're not. The urge to accumulate more than you need and then to do something with the surplus might be one of the oldest human habits there is. So what did they do with it? Where did all that ancient wealth actually go? The answer is stranger than they saved it, because for most of human history, the smartest thing you could do with your wealth was get rid of it. Let me explain. First, we have to fix a misunderstanding about what wealth even meant back then. When you hear ancient riches, you probably picture a pile of gold, a treasure chest, glittering coins. But for the vast majority of human existence, wealth didn't look anything like that. For a hunter-gatherer, hauling around a heap of heavy valuables was pointless. Worse than pointless, it slowed you down. You can't run from a lion while dragging a treasure chest. When your whole life is mobile, the last thing you want is stuff. So early wealth was often something you could carry, wear, or eat. Beads, shells, a particularly fine tool, furs, and above all, food. And the animals that made food. That's the first big shift. Somewhere along the line, humans figured out how to produce more than they needed to survive. A surplus, extra grain in the store, extra animals in the herd. And the moment a surplus exists, a brand new question is born, a question our ancestors had never faced before. What do you do with the extra? That single question, what to do with the surplus, quietly reshaped the entire human world. And the first answers were on 4 legs. Before there were coins, there were cows. For thousands of years across huge stretches of the world, wealth walked around on hooves. Cattle, sheep, goats, camels, living, breathing bank accounts. And it's a genuinely brilliant system when you think about it. Your wealth feeds itself by eating grass you didn't pay for. It produces interest in the form of milk, wool, and more animals. And if a guest arrives or a god needs pleasing, your wealth can turn into a feast on the spot. We're still living inside the shadow of this idea, and most people never notice. Our word capital comes from the Latin for head, as in head of cattle. Pecuniary, a fancy word for anything money-related, comes from pecus, the Latin for livestock. When you talk about your finances, you are, etymologically, talking about cows. But animal wealth had a dark twist. A herd can be wiped out. Disease, drought, a hard winter, a raid in the night, and a rich family could wake up poor. Your fortune could catch a fever and die. So wealth on the hoof was powerful, but fragile. It bought you status, but it could betray you overnight. And that fragility pushed humans toward a very different idea, a way to store wealth that couldn't get sick, couldn't starve, couldn't run away. Something permanent, something you could put in the ground and trust to stay. Which brings us back to the graves. Here's something that breaks a lot of people's brains the first time they hear it. Across the ancient world, over and over, the wealthiest people took their most valuable possessions and deliberately destroyed them, buried them, sank them in lakes, burned them to ash, on purpose, with a straight face. Remember our man with the 3,000 ivory beads? He's not a weird exception. He's part of a pattern that shows up everywhere for tens of thousands of years. Grave goods, gold, weapons, jewelry, food, sometimes whole chariots and horses packed in beside the dead and sealed away from the living forever. To our modern brains, this looks insane. That's a fortune. You could feed a village with that. Why throw it in a hole? But flip your perspective, and it makes perfect sense. For one, if you believe in an afterlife, you're not destroying the wealth at all. You're shipping it ahead. You're packing a suitcase for the longest trip there is. And for another, this was the ultimate flex. In a world with no bank statements and no net worth rankings, how do you prove you're powerful? You prove it by showing you can afford to lose things nobody else could dream of owning. Burying a fortune isn't wasting it. It's a scream, echoing down the centuries. I had so much, I could afford to bury this, and not even blink. The dead man wasn't the audience. Everyone standing around the grave was. Wealth you keep is comfort. Wealth you can afford to destroy is power. And that difference explains more of human history than we like to admit. But this raises a genuinely strange question. If some of the richest ancient people were busy destroying their wealth, how did anyone ever get rich enough to build the palaces, the temples, the pyramids? Because somewhere, someone was clearly doing the opposite. Piling it up. Here's where the story splits in two. The moment humans started farming and staying in one place, something dramatic happened to wealth. For the first time, you could pile it up. A granary doesn't run away. A storehouse doesn't catch a fever. And once wealth could be concentrated, it was, fast and dramatically. This is the birth of a gap that's haunted us ever since. The gap between the people with the full storehouse and the people with the empty hands. In the earliest cities, in places like ancient Mesopotamia, huge amounts of wealth flowed to two addresses: the temple and the palace. The temple, because the gods needed feeding and honoring, and the priests who spoke for them lived very, very comfortably. And the palace, because somebody with a lot of weapons had decided he was in charge. This is where wealth stopped being just beads and cattle and became something new, power over other people. Grain in a storehouse means you can feed workers. Workers you feed can build walls, dig canals, wage wars, and pile up even more grain. Wealth started making more wealth, using human hands as the engine. And the truly wild part? This is where writing comes from. The very first writing we know of isn't poetry. It isn't prayer. It isn't a love letter or an epic tale. It's accounting. Receipts, lists of who owns how much grain, how many sheep, how many jars of oil. Humanity invented one of its most sacred technologies, written language itself, mostly to keep track of rich people's stuff. Let that land. We learned to write so we could count what we owned. So now we've got two opposite instincts colliding. Destroy your wealth to show power versus hoard your wealth to gain power. And for most of history, the people who chose to hoard didn't just get richer. They rewrote the rules of the game so they'd never lose. Now watch this whole thing turn inside out. Here's the reversal. And it might change how you see wealth entirely. We've been treating what did they do with their wealth as a list of options. Bury it, hoard it, wear it, feast on it. Like ancient humans were choosing from a menu, the same way you'd choose between saving money or spending it. But flip the whole thing around. For most of human history, the goal of wealth was not to keep it. The goal was to give it away, as loudly and generously as humanly possible. I know how backwards that sounds. So let me show you. In cultures all over the world, from the Pacific Northwest to ancient chieftains across Europe and beyond, the most respected person wasn't the one with the biggest pile. It was the one who gave the most away. There are documented traditions. The Potlatch of the Pacific Northwest is the famous one, where leaders competed by hosting enormous feasts and handing out or even destroying staggering amounts of their own property in front of everyone. Read that again. They competed at giving. The winner was whoever could afford to be the most generous. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, because it's the same logic as the buried beads, just turned outward toward the living. In a world without banks, you couldn't store wealth safely for long. Herds died, grain rotted, thieves came. So the smartest thing to do with a surplus wasn't to hoard it. Hoarding was risky and frankly a little pathetic. The smart move was to convert it. Convert perishable, stealable, rot-able stuff into something that never decays, obligation. Loyalty, reputation, awe, you give a great feast, and now the whole community owes you. You've turned grain that would have rotted anyway into human beings who will fight for you, work for you, remember you. That's not charity. That's the best investment in the ancient world. The richest ancient humans understood something we've half forgotten. Wealth in a storehouse is just food waiting to spoil. Wealth given away becomes power that lasts. So the pile in the corner wasn't the goal. It was the raw material. And the real currency, the thing everyone was actually chasing, was the memory of your generosity, living on in other people's heads. The ancient rich weren't trying to be wealthy. They were trying to be unforgettable. So let's go back to that grave in Russia, the man and his 3,000 beads. We started by calling it baffling, wasteful even, a fortune dropped into the dark for no reason. But now, maybe, you see it differently. That wasn't waste. That was a statement made in the only language that outlasts a human life. Those beads say, this person mattered. This person was loved, or feared, or honored, enough that a whole community poured months of labor into the ground on his behalf. And here's the quiet, uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. Nothing has really changed. We don't bury gold anymore. But we still spend fortunes on funerals. We still buy things we don't need to signal that we're doing well. We still, deep down, want to convert our money into something that won't rot, a legacy, a name on a building, a memory in the people we leave behind. The forms have changed. The instinct hasn't moved an inch. Because in the end, every human who's ever had more than they needed has faced the exact same question. The hunter with an extra fur. The chieftain with a full granary. You with whatever's sitting in your account tonight. What do you do with the extra? Ancient humans answered it in beads and cattle, in buried gold and burning feasts. And their answer, stripped all the way down, was startlingly simple. You can't take it with you. You never could. So the only wealth that ever really lasts is the kind you turn into other people.